Hello, Dr. Wyatt. How are you this evening?
I'm well, Tim. How are you?
Okay, I'm doing very well myself. I'm so glad we got a chance to interview you here. You have been a practicing forensic psychologist for how long?
Since the early 1980s.
So a little while now, huh?
Yeah, quite a while. I actually retired, and my last case wrapped up about a year ago. So I'm not taking any more new cases, but it has been a very, very interesting part of my career. Of course, mainly, I was a full-time faculty member at Marshall University in West Virginia, and I had worked 10 or 11 years full-time in various clinical settings as well. But I started doing this consulting and with attorneys, and so that really was a very nice thing. So I've enjoyed it, and decided it was time to hang it up.
You were involved in forensic psychology before it became so cool, huh?
Well, maybe so. They have a lot of these television programs now, and they deal with the psychological things that go on, and profilers who try to find the culprits and all that. However, I can tell you that there are almost no jobs for full-time profilers in America. There might be 20 such people working for either the FBI or the CIA or big city police departments. So that's what, the kids want that. They want to be a profiler because they saw it on television. But there are many other things that forensic psychologists do, and what they do mostly is other kinds of things.
What about, and I hear about this just every once in a while, what about a forensic psychologist working as a consultant for jury selection? Do you ever hear about that? Were you ever involved in anything like that?
I was asked to do that a couple of times. It's not a high demand thing. I think most lawyers really have a pretty good feel for that. There probably are some huge cases where that matters more than others. They might want to get a look at the psychological ideas about juries. But, most of it's somewhat more mundane. For example, when I got started, I had a doctoral degree in clinical psychology, and I had about close to 10 years in the field, and I started getting calls from attorneys asking me to consult with them. But it was typically on something like determining competence and responsibility for people who were accused of crimes. Now, for listeners who don't know what that is, typically an attorney would call me and they would say they had a client who had committed a crime. There was no question about it. But the attorney felt that this particular defendant was mentally ill, or perhaps suffering from intellectual deficiency or something of that nature. And so they wanted the answer to two questions. Number one, is the person competent to stand trial? And number two is, was the person at the time he did this crime criminally responsible? Now, what these mean, competence, of course, means whether a person understands the charges against him and is cognizant enough to aid his attorney in his defense, whether he understands the role of the judge, the jury, the lawyer, the prosecutor, and so on. A lot of other questions. And if he is competent, we could put him on trial. But in the United States, if somebody is incompetent, is just so psychotic or of such an incredibly low intellectual level that they can't even meaningfully participate in the trial, the attorney, and we don't put them on trial. We don't let them go either. We typically send them to a secure forensic facility. So that's the first thing that's frequently asked. The second is, at the time of the crime, was he responsible for his actions, or did he suffer from a mental illness, or some kind of mental deficiency or the like that would have enabled, that would have prevented him from conforming his actions to the requirements of the law. And that does happen sometimes.
And that's covered, in some of the cases in your book, which is The Breaking Point Killing and Other True Cases of Murder and Malice, a West Virginia forensic psychologist remembers. It's by W. Joseph Wyatt. And this book got published, a couple years ago?
2015.
2015, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the title case, The Breaking Point Killing, what can you tell us about that particular case?
Well, this is a real interesting case. And by the way, Tim, I worked on about 900 cases in my career.
Not 900?
And I would guess that about 300 of them were what I would call pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Murder, other kinds of crimes. So I selected 11 of those cases, and one case to a chapter to that is the book Breaking Point Killing, plus a couple of general chapters about the field. In this particular case that caused me to name the book Breaking Point Killing, this was a very rural area of West Virginia, a largely rural state anyway, and a man named Earl McCoy, who was a small man who weighed 135 pounds, had been bullied for years by a much bigger man named Emmett Brooks, who weighed about 185. And in the end, Earl McCoy killed Emmett Brooks as a result of this bullying. Now, the bullying over the years included an occasion where Mr. Brooks had shot Earl McCoy and almost killed him.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, he was convicted of that. But it didn't stop there. And nobody could tell me what was the dispute between these two men, why did this happen. But Earl McCoy was trying to get away from Emmett Brooks in his truck, and Brooks took a rifle and fired it through the tailgate and the seat back, hitting Earl McCoy 3 times as he fled. And Earl McCoy had an extensive recuperation, and so on. But after that, and after Emmett Brooks was on the loose again, Brooks continued to harass Earl by, he told a dozen people in this rural county that he intended to kill Earl McCoy, knowing that would get back to Earl. He harassed Earl's wife in a convenience store, running up and down the aisles, cursing at her. He once ran into Earl's brother Luther, who looked just like Earl, on a country road, and Luther was walking down the road, and Brooks chased him into the brush, and Luther was screaming, "I'm going to kill you, Earl," thinking it was Earl. Luther finally had to run up over a mountain to get away. Brooks would sit in his car at midnight outside Earl McCoy's home and just sit out there like as if to say, "I'm watching you, Earl." Well, what happened was, first, Earl became a classic PTSD person, which I examined Earl and testified to that in court. He became an alcoholic because the only way he'd get to sleep at night was by drinking a 6-pack, a 12-pack, and he was drinking in the daytime. He wouldn't leave the house unless he thought it was safe, whatever that meant. So when I examined Earl, I asked him all these questions, and he was quite forthcoming about all this. Didn't try to cover it up, and I did a good interview. I interviewed Earl's wife. He said, "He's not the same man I married," and reviewed numerous documents, police reports, medical reports, you name it. And I came to the conclusion that Earl was indeed a classic post-traumatic stress disordered individual. So I testified about that in court, and with some intervening things that happened, Earl is a free man today. Now, one of the things that's important from a behavior analytic perspective, it's very tempting to say that because of all these things that happened, Earl McCoy caught this disorder, or acquired it, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then post-traumatic stress disorder was inside him, working its way with him and causing him to do all the things he did, including, ultimately, shooting bullets. I departed from that, keeping with my behavior analytic thinking, and I said, well, here's what happened. There were all of these things, this bullying, and parallel to it, Earl McCoy was becoming more nervous, hypervigilant, and so on, all the things we associate with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so all of this bullying caused two things to happen. It caused the anxiety and the sleeplessness and the nervousness and hypervigilance and all those things we call post-traumatic stress disorder. And it also caused him to be going down the road one day, see Emmett Brooks standing in the road, 6 feet away from Brooks's car where two loaded shotguns were in the seat. And when Brooks stepped toward that vehicle, Earl McCoy shot him.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of a difference in thinking there. It's not links in a chain in the sense of bullying led to PTSD, which led to a shooting. Rather, a bunch of things happened. Bullying, and it caused both all these anxiety symptoms and pulling the trigger.
And that earlier description you had, Dr. Wyatt, about PTSD being inside Mr. McCoy, and that caused him. I mean, that's what is commonly referred to as like a medical model, right? Of
yes, a medical biological model.
Right. Well, and like what we try to do here at Criminal Behaviorology, the behavior analytic model is much more a component-driven process, and we're looking for what are the contingencies in the environment that may have led to the behavior.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't say that nothing changed inside of Earl McCoy.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are physiological changes anytime we do anything. If you learn to read, something about your brain changes. If you learn to dance or ride a bicycle, something changes.
Right, of course.
But just because you are bullied and something changes inside your central nervous system does not mean those changes then take on a life of their own and cause you to do things. And that's where I base my thinking in a case like this.
Do you have any speculation about why Emmett Brooks acted the way he did?
Well, we don't know what triggered this first incident, which was the time that Brooks shot Earl McCoy through the tailgate of the truck and so on. I could never figure it out. His lawyers couldn't figure it out. But I think the size discrepancy between the two men, the fact that Brooks was just bigger and stronger is one reason, that it could happen, that Earl was unassertive, meek. He was sort of the Barney Fife type character, for those who watch the Andy Griffith Show.
Right.
And maybe a little nervous to begin with. Another factor, I think, is that it was sort of perversely enjoyable, I think, to Emmett Brooks to know that he could lord it over this weaker guy, somewhat the way any bully might. But beyond that, there was something in Brooks's family that this was well known in this rural county that this was going on, no secret. Nobody, as far as I know, in Brooks's family took him aside and said, you're doing wrong here. You need to stop it. Something bad could happen. So there was an absence of control. And when I gave testimony, as I wrote in the book, I think I put this in the book, there was the deceased's family sitting 10 feet away from me, and I said, unfortunately, every time that Emmett Brooks bullied Earl McCoy. Mr. Brooks was driving another nail into his own coffin. He didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
But that happened. He was turning Earl into a very dangerous man.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't perceive it. Now, another factor might have been that they were in a very rural county where law enforcement was lax.
Mm-hmm.
Not a surprise. Because Earl fought out the police
right.
a number of times, but it didn't seem to help. And I know that county pretty well. And the average response time for a deputy sheriff to get to a crime scene is the better part of 30 minutes. So you can see why Emmett Brooks thought he could do something and then get away.
We hear a lot about bullying nowadays, and I do think it has a lot to do not just with the victim that's being bullied, but of the people and the relationships inside the bully's life. And it may be an attention-maintained thing. It may be an escape from family problems thing, something like that, so that the people closest to the bully are somehow reinforcing or, I suppose, encouraging, perhaps without even realizing it, the bullying behavior.
Maybe so. Maybe they were just chuckling about it and thought it was kind of a hoot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't funny anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the next one I read in there, and this is the actual title of it, He Murdered His Gay Partner. I'll let you, and in that one, well, I'll let you describe that for us. He murdered his gay partner. Could you describe that case for us, Dr. Wyatt?
Sure. This is a case of a man named Jimmy Constantino in his 50s. And by the way, I'm using actual names and such here.
Mm-hmm.
Anything I tell you in this interview is all part of the public domain. It comes from my testimony in court,
mm-hmm.
my written reports that I handed in to the courts, or some of it even newspaper publicity. Mr. Constantino was, by all accounts, a bright and successful guy in a rural county in southern West Virginia. He was a college graduate, had taught school for years and years, and on the side, he had developed a realty business that became quite successful, enough so that as time went by, he quit teaching school, and this is after 30 years or so. And he was a realtor who, in one of his better years, had sold half the properties that were sold in that county. So that tells you he knew what he was about. So he was a gay man, and I think based on my conversations with his lawyer and with his office manager at the realty business and his brother, everybody knew it in the county, and they didn't really care because he was a good citizen. He was the only one, Mr. Constantino was the only one that thought he was in the closet, so to speak. Now, he had a long-term relationship with his partner. They had lived together and owned a house down there in that county for 12 years or thereabouts. So he was a solid citizen, but it was a kind of a redneck county, for lack of a better term. And as a native West Virginian, maybe I get to say that. And, you know, he was careful to not come out of the closet. So anyway, as a smart businessman, you would ask yourself, how could this ever happen? But he got a fax one day which told him that he had inherited $15 million from a long-lost relative in Africa, and that he would have to pay some money to get the money released so he could have all this money. Now, not to be flippant about this, because it did involve a murder, ultimately, but several times in my life, I have actually inherited millions of dollars from a long-lost relative in Africa, if you know what I mean. It's just, it just reeks of scam. But he took the bait.
And I really have to ask about that, because that fascinated me, that someone would be this successful in their life over such a long period of time, dealing with properties and money, and then a fax just comes in and he falls for it. Why do you think that it happened like that?
That's one of the mysteries of the case that I've never really figured that out. I did examine Jimmy Constantino, of course, and submitted my report to the court, all that. But I don't know. That is a puzzler. There was something about him that caused him, maybe it was stars in his eyes, some desire to, really, really make it hugely successfully. I don't know.
That was my sense in reading it. You met him and examined him. I don't know, but my sense is people that fall for these scams, it's a something for nothing deal, and it may have been reaching a point in his life when he thought, after all this time, I should have really hit the big time. And right at that moment, a fax comes in. That's just kind of the picture in my head that comes across in this story.
It could be maybe a little gap in his critical thinking skills. Who knows? But that is a good question. I wish I knew. I just think something so obviously a scam.
Mm-hmm.
It just it defies my thinking.
So after this,
perhaps he just didn't have a lot of experience with slick operators. Wouldn't surprise me either. Scam type people. I may take it for granted because of the career I've had. Suspicious of everything.
Right.
But perhaps he wasn't.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So
to
go on with what happened in the case, he took the bait. He paid thousands of dollars out over a period of a year or so. And finally, he got suspicious, and he said, look, if I don't have this money right away, I'm not giving you guys any more money. And then he got a check. He got 2 or 3 checks totaling nearly $250,000 saying, okay, we're able to spend part of the money. Now, that reinforced all this. And he just, he deposited the checks. Strangely enough, the checks were drawn on the account of a Jesuit school up in New Jersey. And the scammers explained that this was because they had to work through some U.S. conduit, and that school had always been helpful about doing this. Well, translation, the scammers had stolen a checkbook from this Jesuit school in New Jersey and just wrote checks on it and sent them to him. And when he deposited those checks, it didn't take long for the scammers to figure out where they had been deposited and who did it, and the FBI looked into it, and they arrested Mr. Constantino. Now, he had a good lawyer, and in time, the lawyer convinced the authorities that Mr. Constantino was as much a victim as the school up in New Jersey, and they dropped the charges against him. Now, that all was pretty straightforward, but that's when things took a weird turn. The charges were dropped. Jimmy Constantino had the means to pay the money back that he, said he would do that, and they started making good on that. But then he began getting very, very paranoid. He was suspicious that the FBI was still watching him, or that mobsters from New Jersey were going to come and kill him. And he started not going to work, the realty business. He scarcely left the house to go to the grocery store. He waited till the wee hours of the morning, kind of slinking along the aisles at the grocery store so people wouldn't see him. And he got so bad with this that when I talked to his office manager, she told me that he was just not showing up for work, and when he did, he was grungy and tense, mumbling to himself. She had to write notes for him when he was on the phone saying, say this to the customer wanting to buy property. And he even let his realty license lapse because he didn't take his continuing education credits and so on. So he was really functioning very poorly. And around this time, his partner said, I can't take this anymore. You have got to get some professional help, Jimmy. And so he did get some outpatient treatment first once, and then things did not improve. Then the partner made another threat, said, I'm going to leave if you don't get some help. He got a little more help. Then came a fateful day where, and Jimmy was still not being honest with his counselors and psychiatrists. And all he got was medication, really, a little bit of counseling. And one day, on a Friday, as I recall it, he got up in the morning, ate some breakfast. His partner was still asleep upstairs in the bedroom. Jimmy got a gun, went up there, and shot his partner dead point blank. And then, the rest of that day and the next day, he wandered around the house with his partner's dead body, occasionally going up there, he told me, and shouting at the body to get out. Finally, on the third day, on a Sunday, I believe, he called the authorities. They came in and arrested him and put him in jail.
He was there with the deceased person for how long?
In the house for about 48 hours.
Oh my goodness! So
he did make a quick trip to visit his mother.
Okay.
He lived nearby. So the authorities, once he got in jail, he began talking in a very paranoid fashion, saying that the correctional officers were plotting to steal his house, that there were 500 people in the street outside the jail demanding his release. So it's just ridiculous. And with that, his lawyer got him transferred to the psychiatric hospital, and that's where I saw him. And by then, he was starting to come out of the fog a little bit. But I examined him. He certainly wasn't faking a mental illness. He was the real thing. He had become completely psychotic by the time he shot his partner. He was indicted for first-degree murder. One of the factors there, a few days before the shooting, he had called a local cemetery and ordered 2 plots. So that right there suggests premeditation. But I think he had become, even when he made that call, was probably psychotic.
Right.
So I examined him, rendered my report, and I knew that there was no way he was going to walk free. Of course, that almost never happens in these cases, as you know. And he was, I think his lawyer and the judge could see that he was not the right person to be housed with hardcore inmates.
Right.
And so the idea for my examination was to suggest to the judge that he needed some kind of psychiatric facility and not exposed to a general population. So I look back and I say to myself, what factors? You know, we don't want to make this mistake of saying, oh, he had all this scam problem. It caused him to have a disorder called paranoid schizophrenia, and that worked inside of him, and then it caused him to shoot his partner. That is not a good conceptualization. Because, again, the old biological model, or some might call it a Freudian psychodynamic model.
Right.
And it's not an accurate model. Neither one is. Rather, when I looked at this, and I wrote this in my report, what are the factors? And as I described them in the book chapter on Jimmy Constantino, first, smart guy, but maybe looking to make it a little bigger than he really should have, for lack of a better term.
Right.
Second, his life up to this point, I don't think he had been involved with a lot of con artists. Now, you'd think that in the realty business he would have met a few shady people, but, small town where he was, probably 5,000 or 6,000 people, maybe not. Third, I think that being a gay man at that time, and this was all about 15 years ago, and especially in a rural community where the acceptance of differences, including gay people, is not the best, he probably tended to be a little suspicious anyway, and guarded himself against, potential attacks, let's say.
Right.
And I think he probably was lacking something in critical thinking skills to have ever fallen for this ruse of a $15 million inheritance, and from there things really snowballed.
Mm-hmm.
So those are what I call causes.
Uh-huh.
Paranoid schizophrenia, nice description, but not a cause.
Right. Yeah, to just put a label on something, that doesn't really tell us the component parts of how a behavior occurs. It's really not...
Well, that's true. One of the things I've described many times when I was on the witness stand, something like this. Say, look, we have to be careful how we use our terms. Paranoid schizophrenia, okay, that does describe him, but consider this, and I've said this kind of thing to juries and to judges. Okay, suppose he was taken to a doctor, and his partner said, well, what's wrong with him, doctor? Answer, he has paranoid schizophrenia. The partner says, well, he's been doing all this suspicious behavior, and he won't go out anywhere until it's like he thinks it's safe, like 4 o'clock in the morning, and he's even accusing me of things, and accusing his office manager of spying on him, and so he would be doing that because, and the doctor says, because he has paranoid schizophrenia.
Right.
Well then, doctor, how do you know he has paranoid schizophrenia? Well, because he does all these suspicious things.
Yeah.
So there's a circularity there.
Yeah.
And you can see it quickly when it's explained like that, and that's what we want to avoid.
Right. It seemed like psychology, it's the standard accepted psychology is not getting very far beyond just the descriptive or operational definition phase in understanding a problem. While behavior analysis, behavior analysis is looking for function and contingencies that may result in a behavior.
Yeah, I think one of the things that appealed to me and drew me into a behavior analytic perspective and looking at all things, really. And I should say, I'm not saying there aren't some biological causes of some disorders. We would argue about Down syndrome, for example.
Right.
Or a person that obviously has a brain tumor that he was the picture of decorum all his life, and he started behaving very strangely, and there's a big tumor they discovered. I mean, that happens.
Right.
But I'm saying that's the small percentage of the time, and yet we know every day in the town you live in, I live in, some people are going to the doctor and they've been kind of depressed, and they say, doctor, I'm not sleeping well and I don't have any appetite, I'm having crying spells, don't even want to get out of bed. And the doctor says, oh, well, you've got depression. Well, how do you know I have depression? Well, because you don't have any appetite, you don't sleep, you're having crying spells, you won't get out of bed. So it's that circularity.
Right.
And then, of course, the thing that happens is prescription of an antidepressant rather than treatment.
And in one segment of their book, you give a really strong assessment of modern mental health care when you talk about this prescribing of medications. Why do you think the prescribing of medications has become really the dominant treatment method in psychiatric care?
There are two big factors, and they have worked hand in glove together to bring us to the point where so many psychiatric residents these days don't even get training in how to become a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Just medication management.
Mm-hmm.
The two big factors are these. First, going back to the 1960s, really, the profession of psychiatry was losing esteem because young doctors were just avoiding psychiatry as a profession for reasons that were understandable. In fact, the number of new doctors choosing psychiatry through the 1960s dropped by 50%, from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 20.
Mm-hmm.
But they were seeing, I think, psychiatry is mired in the old psychoanalytic mumbo-jumbo.
Right.
Pardon me.
Voodoo.
And, And there were phenomena in the 1960s that kind of brought all of the mental health professions down. Nude encounter groups and primal scream therapy and all kinds of kooky stuff. And,
perhaps we should do a show on nude encounter groups one time. I'll just
that's made for the radio. Right?
Yeah, that's an aside, but yeah, okay.
But so young doctors were not choosing psychiatry, and also around that time, other professions, which they looked on as psychiatrists, as improvers, I think, clinical psychology, counseling, psychiatric social work, and so on, were starting to make headway to getting more patients. So organized psychiatry, I mean by that, the American Psychiatric Association, they decided to address this crisis in their field. They had conferences and so on, and the way, this was in the 1970s, and the way they decided to breathe new life back into psychiatry was to become more biological, to wrap themselves tightly in the cloak of medical respectability, and this brought about a new era. And so by about 1980, a new version of the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual of published by the American Psychiatric Association, was published, a revision of it, and suddenly, by magic, it was declared that most all of these disorders, depression, anxiety, childhood behavior problems, you know, that these were caused in our biology. A chemical imbalance, a genetic defect, or the like, and then the treatment for them would be medications.
Right.
Now, there was little or no research to support this giant shift in worldview by the profession of psychiatry, and there still was very little research for it. But that's what they did to try to, as I say, breathe life back into the profession, and to some extent that worked. Now, parallel to that came the pharmaceutical industry. This was the other big factor that played a role. And always looking for a new market niche, the pharmaceutical industry jumped right in, and of course working hand in glove, and I mean in partnership with the American Psychiatric Association, there came a drug for whatever problem a person had psychiatrically. And that gave rise to the era of more and more antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, antipsychotic drugs, and the like. And I would never say that these never helped anybody at all, just that it quickly became to the point of overkill. So organized psychiatry, trying to work its way back to greater esteem in patients and such, and the pharmaceutical industry, these two powerful forces came together, and they're still at work today. And that is why, so many of the times people actually kind of self-diagnose. They're wrong, mostly, but they'll go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, I've been crying, been really low, and I'm pretty sure I have clinical depression." That's a sort of throwaway term which doesn't have any real meaning.
Right.
Except, I have enough depression, I think I should have treatment. And so doctors are, to many of them, general practitioners with little or no training in psychiatry, and they pass out the drugs. So it's a problem, and I think it hurts people every day when, as well as I do, who have gone to their family doctor and described something about nervous, and the doctor was all too willing to prescribe a pill. And the problem with that is it didn't teach them how to deal better with whatever was going on. And so many times it's not anything in their biology at all, even though the doctor may say, and the television commercials say, you have a chemical imbalance. And serotonin, there's an imbalance of serotonin, and this drug will help it rebalance, and then you'll feel better.
Right.
And the evidence, the research evidence to support that is virtually non-existent.
And plus, even if something does have a biological component to it, that doesn't mean that learned behavior and conditioning couldn't be a treatment for it. Because, if you have a physical injury, you may go to a physical therapist to do activities to strengthen your muscles and your musculoskeletal system, and you're doing an activity to improve yourself, even though the injury was physical. You see what I'm saying?
Of course. In fact, for example, there's a biological component to a muscle tension headache.
Right.
And we've all had one or two of those, and if we live long enough. But that doesn't mean you need a pill.
Right.
You might need relaxation training.
Right.
So there are some instances, I think, for example, someone who's undergone terrible trauma and just can't sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for goodness sakes, maybe an anti-anxiety drug just to help them get some sleep for a week or 10 days, fine. But to go on longer than that, first of all, they're becoming dependent on it if they take it every day for 10 days. Or even a week, and then the problem is, trying to get off it. Not always easy,
right?
Because they start to go through withdrawal signs, symptoms, and get nervous and fidgety, and then they say, "Well, that just proves I'm still nervous."
Yeah,
it just snowballs.
Right. Yeah, that gives us a lot to think about because there's a whole lot of. I've seen a whole lot of patients and people I've known personally that are taking a whole lot of pills, and I think about where this is headed with modern psychiatric care. So that's a very interesting analysis. Dr. Wyatt, I get asked a lot by people about the forensic psychology field, and you are the real thing. You're a real forensic psychologist. What do you think people need to know about the field based on your years of experience?
Well, the first thing is, I'll just reiterate something. If it's that you want to be a profiler, you better be able to do more things than that because you probably cannot make a career out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a good career.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a good area for me. Some of the things that people need to know, I think they need a doctoral degree in clinical psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people trained in other areas of psych where they're not in a clinical field, trained to do treatment, can do some forensic work. I had a colleague who did some of that, but his area of expertise was memory, and he testified sometimes about the problems with memory.
Mm-hmm.
But to do the kind of things I'm talking about, examine people and then testify about them in court, to do that, people need a degree in, preferably a doctoral degree in clinical psychology, although you can do this with a master's in clinical science. Then they need to, in the training, master's or doctoral, they need to pair up with a faculty member who does a lot of this and learn from them by working on cases together. So that's a start. But then they need to know more than that. For example, they need to know about the courts and the processes and what is involved in court. And it's not a walk in the park sometimes, as you know. I think you've done testimony yourself many times, but maybe kind of in a slightly different focus than mine. But, the difference between an expert witness and a fact witness is that an expert can give opinions. A fact witness can tell what they saw or heard, and that's about it. But somebody like myself, I can give an opinion and say, I think that this person suffered from whatever disorder or the like when he did this crime. Beyond that, once you give an opinion, you have to know about the difference between direct and cross-examination.
Right.
And this is why many psychologists only do it once, I think. You get a direct examination from the attorney who hired you. And that's peaches and cream. They love you. You're saying what helps their side of the case. But then you're going to be cross-examined by a smart person who wants nothing more than to make out like you have no clue what you're talking about.
Right.
And in my career, I have been subjected to cross-examination where everything from my training and experience my methods to my genetic structure was questioned on cross-examination, I think. And part of the game there is having a quick answer when you are asked questions that are more or less out of line. And for me, after I had been in it for a while, I recognized that the more kind of extraneous questions I got, the better I felt in a way, because that told me that the cross-examining lawyer would rather focus on anything but what I had actually found out and testified on direct examination.
Bit of distraction there, huh?
Exactly. And so, for example, I got questions like, Dr. Wyatt, how much are you being paid for your testimony today? Answer, well, I'm not paid anything for my testimony, but I am paid for my time, because this kind of thing takes a lot of time. And then I would tell how much I was being paid. End of story. And I don't think that ever hurt me in the jury.
Mm-hmm.
Or some other kind of question like, how many times have you testified for the defense if I'm being cross-examined by a prosecutor? How many times have you testified for the defense? Answer, well, I don't think of myself as testifying for either side. I did my examination, here are the results.
Right.
And so, you have after a while, you get a kind of a stock answer for all those. Oh, and one of my favorites. Now, this is from somebody trying to discredit me. Dr. Wyatt, you're not a psychiatrist, are you? And, of course, in my thought bubble was usually something like, no, thank God. But,
thank God I'm not a psychiatrist.
But I would say, no, I'm a psychologist.
Uh-huh.
Well, what's the difference, Dr. Wyatt? And what they want is that I'm not a medical doctor.
Right.
And my answer, what's the difference? Do you mean in our training or our experience? And, I never had that question when I responded that way. But I got sort of a curious look, a puzzled look on the face of the cross-examiner. And sometimes they would say, well, what's the difference in both of those? Okay. Answer? Well, a psychologist like myself, all of my training is in behavioral sciences and mental health field. All of it. 4 years of training and then a 1-year internship and so on. For a psychiatrist, 4 years of medical school, but usually that's 2 classes in the mental health field and then 6 weeks of what you might call on-the-job training.
Mm-hmm.
And then a residency of 5 years, which is on-the-job training, the first 2 years of which involve very little in the mental health field, but a little bit, and the last 3 years a little more. So that's the difference. You just take it or leave it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's the difference in practice? Well, these days, psychiatrists spend almost all their time, at least my psychiatrist friends, doing med reviews, 15 minutes with a patient, and then move to the next one. Whereas in psychology, we do an hour, or sometimes a little less, an hour or so, of actual therapy, finding out what are the causes of a person's problems. So, you have to, for anyone thinking of going into the field, you have to be ready for the cross-examination.
Mm-hmm.
You get used to it after a while and then go on. One of the things I caution anybody is you cannot be everything to all people.
Right.
But you know your areas of expertise and limit yourself to those. For me, I've just mentioned 2, and they're very common, probably the most common request: assessing competence to stand trial and responsibility for the crime, criminal responsibility or lack of it. Another area that I developed because I began getting a lot of calls from attorneys is assessment of child sexual abuse.
Right.
Now, I had a lot of training in child psychology and the like. I had to make myself an expert in the area of assessing child sexual abuse. What I found out was there are a lot of people out there who really don't know what they're doing, and they can lead a child, this particularly at a young child, age 6 and under. They can ask a lot of leading questions and get a false report.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a lot of cases like that. So
right.
that was one of the other types of cases that I would
That's kind of related to the implanting of memories phenomenon.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Wyatt, you have really told us a lot here. It's a lot of people are interested in the field. I always got the impression forensic psychologists as a specialty were kind of the best of the best to be able to answer such detailed questions in an adversarial environment and deal with, do things like competency and insanity. Do you think people that practice forensically, they have to really know their stuff?
Well, they do, because the worst thing in the world is to get on the witness stand and something happens and you just caught for an answer.
Right.
And you just have to know what you're doing, put it out there, and then not worry too much about what the jury thinks. It's just, there it is, I admit it's hard not to kind of have a little feeling of a written answer. You want your findings to be accepted and so on and so forth, but they can't always be, and you just have to accept that. And then, when you get a lawyer who's trying to be arrogant and make fun of you or bring you down, you can't break your composure. And, I think juries in general are pretty smart, and they will come to the right decision most of the time. And you have to say, there it is, they did what they did. And, it's not always the right decision. And sometimes they can be misled pretty badly, and I put some cases in that book about that. Where a West Virginia State Police psychologist just went to court and lied his head off about his findings, his blood and serology findings, and sent many people to prison for years and years, and that became a national case. It was on 60 Minutes and all those things, and I knew that guy.
Right.
And why he did that, I don't know.
Right.
I put some speculation about that in that chapter.
Yeah. Forensic psychologists have to be especially ethical as well.
You do, because you'll sometimes have a lawyer who wants to get you to do things their way. One lawyer who's pretty bad about that, and I worked a couple, 3 cases for him and I quit, because I would do my examination of his client, render a report, send it to him, and he'd send it back to me, redlined, with all these things he wanted changed. And I would listen to anybody who said, I don't understand this, or are you sure this doesn't make sense? But so I just quit working with him.
Right. If you had it to do all over again, would you do your career the same way?
I would. I always enjoyed being in psychology, and I think I just wondered what makes people do the things they do.
Right.
I always was interested in them. I got into the clinical psych, and actually I had a master's degree in experimental psych, but I decided to change over to clinical. And I just really enjoyed doing that. Like anything, it has its high and low points. It's really interesting things and boring parts. But to me, it's a good career, and I think that comes through in the book that I wrote about it. So there you go.
It certainly does. It is the breaking point killing and other true cases of murder and malice of West Virginia forensic psychologist remembers, W. Joseph Wyatt. You have a book called The Millennium Man. I'll have to check that one out. I've never read that book.
That is a novel, and I'm always in search of a genre. I can't find one. I have a novel which is part science fiction, but it is to teach science fact, called The Millennium Man. And then I had an academic book about the Harvard behaviorist B.F. Skinner. And then I wrote a book about the Boy Scouts, all things, which I was involved in years ago. And then I wrote a book recently about the Iraq War.
Okay.
It came out about a year, not quite a year ago. My son was in the Marine Corps and fought it. And so I have a book about the Iraq War. Yeah.
I'm going to have to check out your Amazon page. I didn't know you did this. You'd written so many
They're
books.
out there.
Okay.